Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the cold, damp, and frankly quite confusing world of the Viking Age. So settle in, maybe adjust your pillow, and dim the lights to that perfect hazy amber. We're going to talk about something a bit grim, but we're going to do it in the most relaxing way possible. We're looking at the accounts of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century traveler who found himself hanging out with a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River. Specifically, we're going to wander through the very long, very elaborate, and very strange ritual surrounding the death of a chieftain and the role of a figure known as the Angel of Death. It's a story about boats, a lot of fermented drinks, and a series of choices that make you realize just how lucky we are to live in an age where honoring the deceased mostly just involves a moderately awkward lunch and some flowers. So, our story starts with Ibn Fadlan, who was essentially a high-level diplomat from Baghdad. He was a man who appreciated order, fine textiles, and probably a very predictable skincare routine. Suddenly, he finds himself in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by these towering, tattooed Vikings who smelled, by his account, like wild onions and didn't really share his views on hygiene. He watches them for a while, taking notes like a very judgmental anthropologist, until one of their prominent leaders finally decides to kick the bucket. Now, for the Russ, you didn't just dig a hole and call it a day. That would be too simple. Instead, they opted for a 10-day-long festival of misery and logistics. When the chieftain died, the first thing they did was put him in a temporary grave for 10 days. They needed this time to sew him a very expensive outfit because apparently you can't meet the gods in your pajamas. During this waiting period, they asked the dead man's slave girls, "Who will die with him?" Now, this is one of those moments where volunteering carries a bit more weight than, say, offering to bring napkins to a potluck. One girl, for reasons that remain a mystery to modern psychology, but were likely tied to a mix of religious fervor and the bleak reality of being a slave in the 10th century, says, "I will." Once she says those words, she's locked in. No takebacks. No, "I was just kidding. I actually have plans that weekend." She is immediately placed under the care of two other girls who follow her everywhere, even washing her feet, which sounds nice until you remember the context. The girl spends her last days singing and drinking, which Ibn Fadlan finds deeply unsettling. She's seemingly happy, or at least putting on a very brave face for the crowd, because in their world, she's about to become a hero. While she's singing, the rest of the Vikings are busy preparing the boat. They drag the chieftain's ship onto the shore and prop it up with 4 wooden posts. It's a lot of manual labor for a funeral, but then again, these people didn't have Netflix, so a massive ritualistic boat burning was probably the social event of the season. They start filling the boat with all sorts of things the dead guy might need in the afterlife. They bring out benches, cushions, and fine Greek brocade. They basically stage a very high-end living room inside a wooden vessel that is destined to become charcoal. Enter the Angel of Death. This wasn't some ethereal winged being from a Renaissance painting. In Ibn Fadlan's account, the Angel of Death was an old woman, described as stout and grim. She was essentially the master of ceremonies, the wedding planner of funerals. She was the one who oversaw the textiles, the arrangements, and eventually the killing. Imagine a very stern grandmother who is also a professional executioner. She's the one who moves the chieftain's body from his temporary grave into the boat. By this point, the chieftain has been in the ground for 10 days, so he's turned a lovely shade of bluish black. Ibn Fadlan, ever the observer of details, notes that the body stinks, but the Vikings just spray some incense and keep moving. They dress the blackened corpse in his new trousers, boots, a tunic, and a cap of gold cloth. They sit him up on the cushions, propping him up so he looks like he's just having a very quiet, very decomposed nap. Because why stop with furniture and fancy clothes? They bring out beer, fruit, and bread, placing them next to the body. Then they bring in a dog, cut it in half, and toss it into the ship, because, of course, you need a bisected dog for the journey. Then they bring in all his weapons. Then they take 2 horses, run them until they're sweating, and then hack them to pieces with swords, throwing the meat into the boat. They do the same with 2 cows, a cock, and a hen. It's a very messy, very expensive butcher shop at this point. The boat is overflowing with luxury goods, dead animals, and one very blue chieftain. While all this carnage is happening, the slave girl is making her rounds. On the final day, the Vikings take her to a structure that looks like a doorframe. It's a symbolic portal. The men lift her up over the frame 3 times. Each time she goes up, she describes what she sees. The first time, she sees her father and mother. The second time, she sees all her deceased relatives sitting together. The third time, she sees her master, the guy in the boat, sitting in a beautiful green paradise. She says he's calling her. This is the part where the crowd gets really into it. They give her a hen, she cuts off her head and tosses it away, and then she's led toward the ship. It's a slow, rhythmic process. The tension is flat, the mood is somber but weirdly celebratory. She hands over her bracelets to the Angel of Death and her finger rings to the angel's daughters. She's slowly being stripped of her earthly possessions as she approaches the wooden ship. She's given a large cup of fermented drink, nabith, and she sings a song for her friends. She's told to drink it up and not be afraid. Of course, she isn't afraid, or at least that's the narrative. She's led to the boat, but she hesitates. The old woman, the Angel of Death, grabs her by the head and drags her onto the ship. This is the moment where the volunteering part of the story feels a bit more like a very dark, very inevitable conclusion to a social contract she didn't really sign. The men begin to beat their shields with sticks. This isn't just for rhythm, it's to create a wall of sound so no one can hear her screams. They want to make sure the other slave girls don't get spooked and refuse to volunteer in the future. It's a very practical, if entirely horrifying, piece of sound engineering. 6 men enter the tent and the ship with her. Ibn Fadlan gets a bit vague here, out of a sense of 10th century decorum, but he mentions a series of ritualistic acts occur before the final moment. Then the Angel of Death takes a cord and makes a noose around the girl's neck, handing the ends to 2 men to pull. While they are strangling her, the old woman takes a broad-bladed dagger and plunges it between the girl's ribs over and over. It's a dual-method execution, just to be absolutely sure. Once the girl is dead, they lay her down next to her master. The couple is finally reunited, which is a very poetic way of saying they are both now corpses on a pile of dead horses and Greek silk. Then comes the fire. The closest relative of the deceased walks up to the boat. He's naked, or nearly naked, and he's walking backward. He's holding a piece of burning wood in one hand, and his other hand is covering his anus, because why not add a little extra quirk to the ceremony? He's walking backward because he doesn't want to see the face of the dead man as he lights the pyre. He reaches back and touches the wood under the ship with the flame. Then the rest of the crowd throws in their torches. The ship, the chieftain, the girl, the horses, the dog, the bread, and the silk all go up in a massive, roaring inferno. A Viking standing near Ibn Fadlan laughs and says, through an interpreter, "You Arabs are fools. You take the people who are most dear to you and you put them in the earth where the worms and insects eat them. We burn them in a moment so that they enter paradise at once." And right at that moment, a strong wind picks up, fanning the flames. The Viking laughs again and says, "See, the Lord has sent the wind to take him away quickly." In about an hour, the entire thing, the ship, the girl, the master, is nothing but gray ash. They build a mound over the spot, stick a piece of birch wood in the center with the dead man's name on it, and then everyone goes home to probably sleep for 3 days. It's a bizarrely casual ending to such a high-stakes event. For Ibn Fadlan, it was a traumatic cultural exchange he'd never forget. For the Vikings, it was just Tuesday, or, well, a very busy Friday. The Angel of Death would go back to her tent, the men would go back to their trade routes, and the slave girl was simply gone, having fulfilled her role in a cosmic drama she never asked to star in. It's the kind of history that makes you appreciate the relative silence of a modern graveyard. Let's float away from the smoky banks of the Volga now. Let's leave behind the smell of charred birch and the sound of shields being struck. We're moving toward a different kind of tragedy, one that doesn't involve boats or fire, but is perhaps just as sophisticated in its own way. We're going to drift toward the royal courts of Europe, where the walls were thick, the air was still, and the people were sometimes just... So, let's stay here for a while longer. Let's not leave the riverbank just yet. The fire has died down to a dull, pulsing orange glow, and the smell of the smoke, a heavy, cloying mixture of expensive incense, burnt animal fat, and salted wood, is starting to settle into the low-lying mist. Ibn Fadlan is standing there, probably clutching his robes, looking at the heap of glowing embers that used to be a ship, a chieftain, and a young woman. And he's thinking, as we are, about the sheer exhausting logistics of it all. Because, of course, the ritual didn't actually end when the flames went out. That would be too efficient for the Rus. You see, after the fire, there was the silence. A very specific kind of silence that follows a 10-day-long roar of drinking and chanting. The Vikings didn't just walk away and leave a messy pile of ash. They were meticulous. They began to gather around the site of the pyre to build the kurgan, or the burial mound. This wasn't a quick job. It was a communal act of manual labor, a slow, rhythmic shoveling of earth that served as a come-down from the intensity of the sacrifice. They moved like shadows in the twilight, piling dirt over the scorched remains until they had created a small artificial hill. It was a physical bump in the landscape, a permanent reminder that someone important, and someone who died for him, lay beneath the soil. And then they did the most Viking thing possible. They put up a sign. They took a large post of birchwood, smoothed it down, and carved the name of the dead chieftain and the name of the king of the Rus onto it. It's such a strangely modern touch, isn't it? After all that archaic violence and symbolic door lifting, they end the ceremony with a name tag. They wanted to make sure that if anyone wandered by this specific bend in the Volga 100 years later, they'd know exactly whose ashes were fertilizing the grass. It was about legacy, even if that legacy was built on a foundation of bisected dogs and strangled girls. But let's circle back to the girl for a moment, because the Angel of Death wasn't finished with the living quite yet. You have to wonder about the other slave girls, the ones who didn't say, "I will," when the question was asked. Ibn Fadlan noticed them. They were there, watching the smoke, watching the old woman work. In the Viking world, being the one who stayed behind wasn't necessarily a relief. It was a shift in status. They had watched their companion be elevated to a sort of temporary goddess, showered with drinks and jewelry, only to be systematically dismantled in a tent. The psychology of the camp in the days following the burning must have been incredibly heavy. The Angel of Death would have walked among them, still grim and stout, perhaps already looking at the next set of girls, wondering which one had the right temperament for the next inevitable death. Because in this society, death wasn't an interruption, it was a scheduled event. The old woman wasn't a villain in their eyes, she was a necessary bridge. She was the one who ensured the transition from this world to the next was done correctly, and correctly in the 10th century usually meant violently. Ibn Fadlan's account lingers on the way the Vikings talked about the fire. They were so incredibly smug about it. They looked at him, a man from a civilization with libraries, hospitals, and complex legal codes, and they essentially called him a barbarian because he buried his dead in the dirt. To them, the fire was the ultimate kindness. It was a fast-track ticket. They believed that as the smoke rose, it physically carried the soul into the clouds. If the wind blew hard, which it did because the Volga is a windy place, it was a sign of divine approval. His lord, from love of him, has sent the wind to fetch him, they told Ibn Fadlan. It's a beautifully poetic way to describe a localized ecological disaster. But imagine the sensory overload for our diplomat friend. He spent 10 days watching people get progressively more intoxicated on nabid, a fermented date or grain drink that was likely potent enough to peel paint. He's watched the chieftain's temporary grave be opened, revealing a body that had essentially fermented in its own juices for over a week. He's watched the Angel of Death daughters wash the girl's feet while she sang songs that were probably more about resignation than joy. And through it all, there's this casual, dry humor from the Vikings. They're cracking jokes while hacking horses into pieces, because why not keep the mood light when you're elbow deep in a ritual sacrifice? The irony of the Angel of Death title is that she didn't bring death, she organized it. She was a bureaucrat of the afterlife. She made sure the Greek cloth was folded right. She made sure the noose was tight. She made sure the dagger hit the right spot between the ribs. She was the guardian of the proper way. And in the dark, cold nights of the Viking Age, the proper way was the only thing keeping the existential dread at bay. If you did the ritual right, the sun would come up, the crops would grow, and your chieftain would be feasting in a green meadow instead of haunting your longhouse. As the mound was finished, the Vikings didn't linger in grief. That's not really the vibe. They headed back to their ships, they had trade to conduct, they had furs to sell, honey to barter, and more slaves to capture. The funeral was a massive expenditure of capital. The boat alone was a fortune, let alone the silk, the livestock, and the girl. It was a display of conspicuous consumption that would make a modern billionaire blush. They were burning their wealth to prove they had so much of it that it didn't even matter. Ibn Fadlan eventually left them, moving on to his next diplomatic headache, but you can tell in his writing that he never quite got the smell of that pyre out of his clothes. He describes the Rus as the filthiest of God's creatures, but he couldn't stop watching them. He was fascinated by the Angel of Death, this grandmotherly executioner who commanded more respect than the warriors. She was the one who held the keys to the next world. So, as we imagine that birch post standing alone on the riverbank, the wind whistling through the carvings of a dead man's name, let's think about the silence that finally settled over the Volga. The birds would have come back eventually, picking through the edges of the mound. The grass would grow back greener than before, fed by the carbon and the ash of the sacrifice. And the Angel of Death would sit by her own fire, waiting for the next time someone asked, "Who will die with him?" The story of the Viking funeral is a story of a world where the line between life and death was as thin as a piece of Greek silk. It was a world of harsh beauty and even harsher rules. And through it all, the Angel of Death kept her dagger sharp and her noose ready, making sure the gods got exactly what they were promised. Take a slow breath now. The fire is completely out. The smoke has vanished into the stars. The river is flowing quietly, just as it did 1,000 years ago. There's no more chanting, no more beating of shields, just the cold, dark water and the steady pulse of history. All right, so let's float gracefully from the slightly smoky, rather speculative world of Greek fertility rituals to the very well-documented yet equally tragic saga of Charles II of Spain. Now, if you're looking for a poster child for what happens when royal families just keep it in the family for a few too many generations, Charles II is your guy. He was, to put it mildly, a walking, talking, and often drooling testament to the perils of inbreeding. Born in 1661, Charles II was the last Habsburg king of Spain. And when I say last, I mean the absolute last. There was no coming back from Charles. His dynasty essentially hit a genetic brick wall with him. Imagine being the end of an era, not because of some grand military defeat or a philosophical shift, but because your family tree was less of a tree and more of a very tangled, highly repetitive shrub. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Sounds normal enough, right? Except Mariana was Philip's niece. Yes, his niece. Because why not keep the royal bloodlines pure, right? Purely in the sense of recycling the same genetic material over and over again until it starts to fray at the edges. This wasn't an isolated incident either. The Spanish Habsburgs were practically professional inbreeders. Out of 16 great-great-grandparents, Charles II effectively only had two. Think about that for a second. Two. That's like trying to make a diverse playlist with only two songs on repeat for centuries. It's going to get stale, and in this case, a bit genetically problematic. From the moment he was born, it was clear Charles was not going to be winning any most robust baby competitions. He was sickly, frail, and suffered from a litany of ailments. He couldn't speak until he was 4, couldn't walk until he was 8, and was prone to convulsions and illnesses throughout his life. His mother, Mariana, was so protective and terrified of losing him, especially after losing several other children, that she kept him wrapped in cotton wool, quite literally. He was coddled, overprotected, and likely missed out on a lot of the basic development that other children would naturally get. His most famous physical characteristic, of course, was the Habsburg jaw. This wasn't just a slight overbite. We're talking about a seriously protruding lower jaw combined with a rather large tongue. This made speaking incredibly difficult and eating an absolute nightmare. Food often dribbled out of his mouth and he struggled to chew. Imagine being the king, the most powerful man in Spain, and every meal is an exercise in public humiliation. It's a tragic image, really. He also had a tendency to drool quite a bit, which probably didn't help his regal image. Historians and doctors, looking back, suspect he suffered from a combination of genetic disorders. Beyond the famous jaw, he likely had a severe form of mandibular prognathism, along with a range of other conditions including intellectual disability, epilepsy, and various kidney and digestive problems. He was essentially a medical textbook of genetic misfortunes. Despite all this, he was crowned King of Spain at the tender age of 3. Now, imagine a 3-year-old trying to rule an empire that spanned the globe. It's ridiculous, of course, so his mother, Mariana, served as regent, and Spain was effectively governed by a series of power-hungry courtiers and political factions who constantly bickered and jockeyed for influence. Charles, in the meantime, was largely a pawn, moved about by stronger wills, unable to assert much authority himself. He was the king, but not really the ruler, more like a very expensive, very frail figurehead. His upbringing was equally disastrous. He was educated, certainly, but his intellectual capabilities were limited. He was easily swayed, often superstitious, and deeply religious, bordering on fanaticism. This was a man who believed he was possessed by demons and underwent several exorcisms. Because, of course, if you're feeling constantly unwell and your jaw is jutting out at an unnatural angle, it must be the work of evil spirits, not centuries of questionable marital choices. The exorcists, no doubt, had a field day with him. The pressure to produce an heir was, naturally, immense. The entire future of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty rested on his shoulders, which, by all accounts, were not very strong shoulders. He was married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a French princess who was, by all accounts, beautiful and lively. She came to Spain full of hope, only to find herself trapped in a rigid, deeply religious, and rather depressing court, married to a king who was physically repulsive and intellectually challenged. Her letters reveal her profound unhappiness and loneliness. She eventually died, childless, after just 10 years of marriage, likely from appendicitis, a rather sad end to a rather sad life. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was brought in with the explicit purpose of producing an heir.
She was, according to accounts, a strong-willed woman, perhaps a little too ambitious for her own good. She quickly realized that Charles was incapable of fathering children, and despite various bizarre treatments and desperate prayers, no heir was forthcoming. The court became a hotbed of intrigue and gossip, with everyone blaming everyone else for the lack of a royal baby. Maria Anna, in particular, was often the target of venomous rumors, despite the problem clearly lying with her husband. Charles himself was acutely aware of his physical and mental deficiencies. He was a deeply unhappy man, plagued by illness and the constant burden of his dynasty's fate. He would often visit the crypt of his ancestors, looking at their decaying remains, reportedly seeking answers or comfort. It's a chilling image, the sickly king standing among the bones of his family, wondering why he was the way he was. He supposedly even touched the corpse of his first wife, Marie-Louise, feeling a deep sadness for her. The constant speculation about his inability to produce an heir, the whispers, the political maneuvering around his succession, all weighed heavily on him. Towards the end of his life, he was practically an invalid, unable to perform his royal duties, constantly ill, and barely able to communicate. He died in 1700 at the tender age of 38, leaving behind no direct heir. His autopsy report was rather comprehensive, noting a body that was essentially decaying from the inside out, with a brain described as small and soft. Not exactly glowing remarks for a king. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that lasted for over a decade as various European powers fought over who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. All because one man, the product of generations of inbreeding, couldn't produce a healthy child. It's a stark, rather depressing example of how personal lives, even of the most elevated royals, can have massive, far-reaching consequences. And all because, apparently, keeping it in the family seemed like a good idea at the time. A truly tragic figure, Charles II, the last gasp of a powerful dynasty, extinguished not by conquest, but by biology. So, while the Greek Dark Ages offered symbolic, womb-burning rituals to encourage fertility, the Spanish Habsburgs inadvertently perfected a form of womb-ending through their relentless pursuit of pure bloodlines. The irony, of course, is that in seeking purity, they created weakness, ultimately leading to their own genetic demise. Now, as we let the image of poor Charles II fade into the mists of history, let's turn our attention to another royal who faced immense pressure to produce heirs, and who navigated a world of political intrigue and personal unhappiness with a surprising degree of resilience, or perhaps just a very strong will. We're going to take a gentle journey to the rather dramatic life of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Take a deep breath